Nychi had long grown accustomed to the soundtrack of her life. The harsh crack of her father's voice cutting through the stillness of the night, followed swiftly by her mother's agonizing screams. Those sounds had etched themselves into the very walls of their home, sinking deep into the marrow of her bones. They weren't just a part of the night, they were a part of her. The terror always began the same way. Her father's heavy boots pounding against the hard, uneven floor as he stormed through the front door. The slamming of the door reverberated through the small house like the signal of a coming storm. The violence, inevitable as a downpour, was next. Nychi would shrink into herself, listening as her mother's cries filled the air, her heart sinking lower with each sob. But that was before the screams had started to include her own. From the time she could remember, her father was a man consumed by bitterness, a hatred that seemed to have no origin except for his insatiable hunger for power and control. Her mother had borne the brunt of it, her body weathering blow after blow for years, all while carrying the weight of his endless accusations. She had failed to give him a son. He spat the words at her with venom, as though she had deliberately chosen not to bear him a male child, as though it was her fault alone. Then, everything changed, or so it seemed, when her mother finally gave birth to Chukwudi. For a brief, fleeting moment, hope fluttered in the small home. A son, the son her father had demanded for years, had arrived. Surely now the violence would cease, now that the cause of his fury had been resolved. But that hope was fragile, too fragile to survive in the presence of a man whose cruelty ran as deep as his resentment. It didn't take long for the beatings to return, and this time with an even more dangerous edge. Chukwudi's presence hadn't softened him, it had only fueled his sense of entitlement, his belief that he owned everyone under his roof. As Nychi grew older, her father's venom, once reserved solely for her mother, turned its attention toward her. She had become another target for his rage the moment she took on responsibilities around the house. Each day he found something new to punish her for, no matter how small. A streak of dust on the window, a chore done too slowly, or a plate left slightly askew on the table, all became reasons for him to lash out. "Lazy, good-for-nothing girl," he would sneer, his breath hot with fury, his shadow looming over her as though it were a beast about to devour her whole. His strikes came fast and brutal, leaving marks that stayed long after the pain faded. And her mother, trapped in her own cycle of helplessness, could only watch with tear-filled eyes, too afraid to intervene. The few times she had tried to protect Nychi, the violence doubled, her body absorbing the blows meant for her daughter. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the familiar sounds of dread began again. Her father's boots, heavy as ever, stomping through the house. Nychi's body went rigid as she heard his voice thundering through the walls, calling her name with a hatred that could only mean one thing. Tonight, it would be her turn. Her heart seized in her chest, every beat a hammer against her ribs. Fear gripped her so tightly that she could barely move, her legs refusing to obey as her name reverberated through the house like a death sentence. Nychi. Her father's roar shook the air, and panic surged within her. She had to run anywhere. Her body finally broke free from its paralysis, and she bolted towards her room, her breath shallow, her mind racing for a solution, a hiding place, something, anything to protect her. She slammed the door shut behind her, her eyes darting around the small space. Where could she go? There was nowhere to hide. Her father would find her, just as he always did. Then, in her frantic search, something caught her eye. A light, just a flicker, barely visible behind the closet. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stared at it, confused. It wasn't possible, was it? There shouldn't be light there, but it was undeniable, a soft, pale glow. And then, just as she started to doubt her eyes, she heard it. A voice. It was gentle, not harsh like her father's, not cold like the silence that had filled their home for years. It was soft, warm, and inviting, like a whisper meant only for her. Nychi? Her pulse quickened, and she blinked, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her. But there it was again, the same voice, calling her name with such tenderness that it felt like an embrace. Trembling, she took a step towards the closet, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. Slowly, she pushed it open, her fingers brushing past the hanging clothes until they touched something cold, something that shouldn't be there. The back of the closet wasn't solid. It gave way under her hand, as if a secret door had been waiting for her all along. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be an escape? Without thinking, she squeezed herself through the narrow gap. Her body pressed against the cold wood of the closet as the strange light grew brighter. She pushed further, crawling through the tiny space, and then in a blink, she was free. Free from the dark room she had just left. Free from the terror that haunted her home. Nychi's eyes widened in disbelief as she stepped out into a room bathed in golden light. The walls shimmered with warmth. The first thing that struck Nychi was the smell. Warm, inviting, the kind of scent that wrapped around you like a soft blanket. It wasn't the stale, harsh air of her real home. This was different, comforting, and filled with sweetness. Her breath hitched as she inhaled deeply, her senses overwhelmed by the rich aromas of something delicious cooking, something she hadn't smelled in years. She blinked, trying to make sense of where she was, her eyes darting around the room. But it wasn't her room. She was no longer in the cramped darkness of the closet. Instead, she stood in a spacious, beautifully decorated room, bathed in the gentle glow of candlelight. The walls were adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the flickering light, casting soft shadows that made the space feel alive, almost magical. Everything about the room exuded warmth, from the rich wooden floors to the plush cushions scattered around a low dining table, carefully set with steaming bowls of food. Her heart raced in confusion. How had she ended up here? As she scanned the room, her eyes landed on two familiar figures seated at the table. Her breath caught in her throat. Her parents, but not the parents she had known all her life, not the ones filled with rage, bitterness, and cold indifference. No, these parents looked at her with something she had never seen before. Love. Her mother, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, smiled softly, her eyes warm and full of affection. There was no sign of the exhaustion that had lined her face for years, no traces of fear or sadness. She looked serene, her entire being radiating a calmness that felt foreign to Nychi. And beside her sat her father. The same man who had terrorized her for as long as she could remember, now sat with a gentle smile, his face free of the usual scowl, his eyes filled with warmth instead of fury. His voice, when he spoke, was unrecognizable. "Come, Nychi," he said, his tone gentle, as though he had never raised his voice in anger. "Sit with us, we've made dinner for you." Nychi stood frozen, her mind spinning. Was this real? Could this truly be happening? Her legs felt like they were stuck in place, her heart thundering in her chest. She wanted to run, to retreat back into the familiar chaos of her world, but something in their voices, so calm, so tender, beckoned her forward. Slowly, almost mechanically, she moved toward the table, her feet shuffling on the soft rug as if in a trance. Her mother's arms stretched out, beckoning her closer, the same arms that had once been too weak to protect her, now offering solace. "Come, my dear," her mother said, her voice like honey, "you must be hungry." As Nychi sat at the table, she could hardly believe what was happening. Her heart raced, but not with the usual dread that filled her real home. This world, this table, these people, they were familiar but foreign all at once. Could these be her parents? Could these kind, loving figures sitting before her be the same people who just hours ago had been steeped in rage and neglect? She reached for the food, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up a spoon, scooping the steaming meal into her mouth. The taste was unlike anything she had ever eaten, rich, flavorful, comforting. It filled her belly with warmth, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness she felt in her real life. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging. There were no harsh words, no demands, no violent outbursts, only soft murmurs of love and reassurance as they watched her eat. Her father, the man whose anger had once shattered her spirit, spoke to her in gentle tones, asking about her day, complimenting her on her hard work. Her mother reached across the table, patting her hand tenderly, as though they had never known pain or fear. The world outside, the one she had just escaped, began to fade away. Here in this secret haven, there was no pain, no fear, only peace. But as the night stretched on and the warmth of the candles dimmed, Nychi began to feel a tug in her chest, a reminder that this world was not her own. She could not stay here forever. Morning would come soon, and with it, the cruel reality she had fled. Reluctantly, she excused herself, rising from the table. Her mother and father smiled at her, reassuring her that she could return anytime. "We'll always be here, waiting for you," her mother whispered as she kissed Nychi's forehead softly. When Nychi stepped back into the cramped closet, she felt a momentary pang of fear. Had it all been a dream? But when she opened her eyes again, she was in her own bed, the dim light of early morning creeping through the cracks in the window. But something had shifted. Her body felt lighter, as if the weight she had carried for so long had lifted, even if just for a moment. The screams and chaos of her home no longer seemed to penetrate her as deeply. She slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake her real parents, and began her morning chores, her movements swift and silent. By the time her father rose, she had already finished sweeping the house, prepared breakfast, and left for school. She had perfected the art of disappearing, of becoming invisible, unseen in the house that once loomed over her like a prison. Yet every day after school, she rushed home, eager to return to her secret world, the place behind the closet where her loving parents waited. She knew it wasn't real, knew that the parents in her real world would never love her like that. But it didn't matter. In the haven, she was adored. She was safe. She was everything she had ever wanted to be. And so it began, her double life. The silent, invisible child of the real world, and the cherished daughter of the world behind the closet. It became her new reality, a place where she could escape the harshness of her life, if only for a few hours each night. But as the years passed, and her visits to the haven grew longer, Nychi began to wonder. Was she truly escaping, or was she losing herself in a world that could never be real? As the years crept by, Nychi honed her skill of disappearing, a talent born from necessity, perfected through pain. She no longer needed to wait for the familiar rise of her father's voice or the cold indifference of her mother's silence. By the time dawn broke over their small, oppressive house, Nychi was already awake, moving like a shadow through the rooms. She worked quickly, quietly, a ghost in her own home. Every surface was scrubbed, every dish cleaned, every task completed before the rest of the house even stirred. It became her armor, the perfection of her chores, a shield that kept her from becoming a target. Her father no longer had to throw his fists in anger. Her mother no longer had to endure the echoes of their mutual suffering. Nychi had made herself invisible, and it suited her perfectly. Each morning, after her chores were done and the house fell back into its heavy silence, Nychi slipped out unnoticed, like the early fog that evaporates before the sun rises fully. At school, she blended in, neither exceptional nor invisible, just another face in the crowd. But school wasn't the escape she craved. No, the real freedom came later. When the sun began to sink and the shadows grew long, she hurried home, her heart pounding in anticipation of what waited beyond the closet door. The haven had become her sanctuary, a world far removed from the harshness of reality. Each night, as the soft light flickered from the tiny space behind her closet, Nychi stepped through the veil of her secret world, leaving behind the coldness of her real life. In the haven, the air was always warm, always welcoming. The meals were ready, steaming, the aromas wrapping her in a cocoon of comfort. And her parents, those perfect versions of the ones she'd left behind, waited for her with open arms, their faces glowing with love and pride. There were no harsh words here, no accusations, no cold stares. Instead, her mother would greet her with a soft smile, her voice gentle as a whisper. "Welcome home, Nychi. We've missed you." Her father, always the first to take her hand, would lead her to the table, his eyes filled with warmth. "You've worked hard today, my dear. Sit with us." In this magical world, Nychi became everything she couldn't be in reality. Here, she wasn't the girl who scrubbed floors and avoided blows. She was the adored daughter, the cherished child. Her parents encouraged her, praised her for her intelligence, her resilience. They were the parents she had longed for but never known in her waking life. The ones who saw her potential, who whispered sweetly of her future. As she grew older, the haven changed too. It wasn't just a place of refuge anymore. It became the place where her dreams began to take shape. "You're destined for great things," her father would say, his eyes twinkling with pride as he handed her a stack of books. "Study hard. You deserve more than this life." Her mother, always by her side, would nod in agreement. "You're meant for bigger things, Nychi. You just have to reach for them." Their words were like a balm to her wounded soul. In the haven, Nychi felt seen, felt valued in ways she had never experienced in her real life. And so every evening after school, she rushed home, not out of duty but out of a need to return to her real family, the ones who loved her unconditionally behind the closet door. The real world faded into the background. Her father and mother, trapped in their endless cycles of abuse and indifference, barely noticed her anymore. She had become so efficient at making herself small that they didn't even need to acknowledge her presence. She was a machine, a perfect automaton that cleaned, cooked, and moved silently through the house. The chores were always done. There was no need for her father's fists, no need for her mother's futile protests. In their eyes, she barely existed, and that was exactly what Nychi wanted. She poured herself into her studies, seeking refuge in the pages of her textbooks, knowing that knowledge was her only way out of this life. Her teachers praised her, noticing how diligently she worked, how focused she seemed on her future. But no one knew her real secret. No one knew that her true mentors lived behind a closet door. Her nights in the haven grew longer as her real life became more unbearable. In this magical space, her parents didn't just provide love. They became her guides, her confidants. They helped her prepare for exams, sitting beside her as she studied late into the night. Her father's voice, always calm and steady, would offer quiet reassurances as she worked through complex problems. Her mother's soothing words would encourage her whenever she doubted herself. And then, one evening, something changed. She sat with them at the dinner table, her plate filled with food she had come to love in this otherworldly place. The warmth of the candles flickered around them, casting everything in a soft glow. Her father leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "Nychi," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "It's time for you to apply for the scholarship, the one your school is offering. It's your chance to leave this place, to truly escape." She blinked, taken aback. Her parents in the haven had never spoken so directly about her future. They had always encouraged her, always pushed her to believe in herself. But this was different. This was a call to action. "You deserve so much more than this," her mother added, her hand gently brushing Nychi's cheek. "You've worked hard for this. It's time to take that step." Nychi nodded, feeling the weight of their words settle in her chest. This was her chance. Her way out. Her real-life parents hadn't mentioned the scholarship, of course. They barely noticed her existence. But here in the haven, her parents believed in her, saw her potential, pushed her to dream beyond the boundaries of her small, suffocating world. From that moment on, Nychi threw herself even deeper into her studies. Every day at school, she worked tirelessly, driven by the promise of escape. And every night, she returned to the haven, where her parents sat with her, guiding her through every application, every essay, every exam. They were with her in ways her real parents never were, lifting her up, reminding her that she was capable of achieving so much more. The lines between her two worlds grew blurrier, the boundary between reality and the haven no longer clear. Nychi existed in both, but it was the magical world behind her closet where she truly lived. When the letter arrived, the world seemed to still for a moment. Nychi stared at it, her hands trembling, hardly daring to breathe. The official seal of the university gleamed at her from the crisp envelope, full of promises she had only ever dreamed of. Slowly, she tore it open, her heart pounding with every second that passed. And there it was. The words danced on the page in front of her, almost surreal. "Congratulations, you've been awarded a full scholarship." The air seemed to rush out of her lungs all at once. She had done it. She had escaped. The S in scholarship was more than a chance at an education. It was her lifeline, her escape from the suffocating walls of her house, from the cold indifference of her real parents. It was her key to freedom. Yet as pride swelled in her chest, another feeling crept in. A cold, creeping dread. The haven. The thought of leaving her magical world behind, the one safe place that had sustained her through the years, filled her with an overwhelming sense of loss. She had built her entire existence on the promise of the haven, and now, the very thing she had yearned for, her escape, was threatening to sever her connection to it forever. She tried not to think about it. She told herself that this was what she wanted, what she needed. But as the days ticked down to her departure, the weight of leaving behind her secret world hung over her like a shadow. Finally, the day came. The sun rose slowly, casting a golden light over her familiar room, the same walls that had seen her worst fears and her deepest dreams. Nychi stood in front of her closet, her heart aching with the knowledge that this was the last time she would stand here, the last time she would cross that invisible threshold into the world that had sheltered her for so long. She opened the closet door, her hands trembling. The soft light from the haven beckoned her, but there was no joy in her step this time. Her idealized parents, the ones who had loved her so fully and completely, stood waiting, just as they always did. But today there was something different. Tears glistened in their eyes, and the sight of it broke something deep inside Nychi. Her mother stepped forward first, her arms wrapping around Nychi in a warm embrace, just as she had done so many times before. But this time, her voice trembled with emotion as she whispered, "Remember, Nychi, we're always with you. No matter where you go, you carry us with you." Nychi clung to her mother for a moment longer, the scent of safety and love filling her senses. She didn't want to let go. She didn't want to leave behind the only place that had ever made her feel whole. Her father stepped forward next, his eyes soft with love. "You've made us so proud, my dear," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that she had never heard in the real world. "You've worked so hard for this moment, and now it's your time to soar, but we'll always be here for you." She nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. She didn't want to leave. How could she? The haven had been more than just an escape. It had been her lifeline. It had saved her from the horrors of her real life, had given her a place to breathe, to be loved. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't live her life forever hidden behind a closet door. When she finally stepped back, her parents smiled at her through their tears, their love wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "It's time, Nychi," her mother whispered, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. "But we will always be with you, no matter where you go." Tears welled in Nychi's eyes as she nodded, her chest aching with the weight of goodbye. She turned and stepped through the closet door one last time, feeling the familiar pull of the real world around her. The sunlight in her room seemed brighter now, harsher, as if it was trying to burn away the dream she had just left behind. She closed the door softly, her hand lingering on the handle for a moment longer. Was the haven real? Or had it all been in her mind? She didn't know, and maybe she didn't want to know. The line between reality and illusion had always been blurred, and that was what made it so comforting. Whether the haven had existed physically or only in the depths of her imagination didn't matter. Because it had saved her. It had given her the strength to survive when her real life had become too much to bear. And now, as she stood on the brink of her new life, she realized that the haven would always be a part of her, tucked away in the corners of her heart. As she walked out of the house for the first time, her real parents barely acknowledged her departure. Her mother sat silently, her eyes glazed over as she washed dishes, and her father, ever the tyrant, grunted from his spot on the couch, not bothering to look up. They didn't care where she was going, only that she would continue to send money once she was settled at university. In their eyes, she had become nothing more than a means to an end, a source of income. But Nychi didn't care. Their indifference couldn't touch her now. She had grown beyond them, beyond the pain and the neglect. As she walked down the road, her bag slung over her shoulder, she felt a strange lightness, as though the weight of the past had finally been lifted. With each step, she moved further away from the place that had once imprisoned her, her heart beating with the thrill of freedom. But even as she left, the whisper of her mother's voice from the haven lingered in her ears. "We're always with you." And somehow, she knew it was true. The haven, whether real or imagined, wasn't gone. It lived on inside her, a part of her that she could carry with her wherever she went. It had taught her to dream, to survive, and now it was time to live. With a final glance over her shoulder at the house that had once been her prison, Nychi turned toward her future. The sun shone brightly on the path ahead, and for the first time in her life, she felt ready to walk it. If you're curious to find out what happens next, stay tuned for part 2 of The Haven. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Let us know your thoughts. Do you think Nychi will return to the Haven, or would she outgrow it? Leave a comment with your predictions below and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Your support helps us continue bringing these captivating stories to life. Thanks for watching African Folktales by Nychi, and we can't wait to share more with you.